12 warriors fought for the Apache girl's hand, but she pointed at the handsome gunslinger alone. The wind spoke first, a long, mournful sound that scoured the plains and bent the brittle grass low to the earth. It was a language of emptiness, of endless horizons and a sky so vast it could swallow a man's hope whole. Silas heard it not as a threat, but as a familiar quietude, the same silence that had settled in his own chest years ago and never left. He was mending a split rail on the far edge of his property, the rhythmic strike of his hammer a lonely percussion against the sigh of the wind, when he saw them. A woman and a child, two small figures etched against the immense, indifferent landscape. They were walking, but it was the kind of walking that was close to an end, a slow, stumbling prayer for solid ground. The woman's shoulders were slumped, her head bowed against the ceaseless wind. The small boy at her side held tight to the fringe of her skirt, his own steps a faltering echo of hers. They were not heading toward his cabin, but past it, following the faint trace of a wagon road that led to nowhere good. Silas stopped his work. The hammer fell silent in his hand. He watched them for a long time, his face carved into the same stoic lines as the weathered fence posts he was tending. He saw the way the woman's knees buckled slightly with each step, the way she would pause to steady herself before forcing her body onward. He saw the dust caked on their clothes, the exhaustion that was more than just a lack of sleep. It was a weariness of the soul. He felt nothing, he told himself. It was not his concern. The world was full of wandering souls, and he had made his peace with being apart from it. He had his land, his silence, and the ghosts he kept for company. That was enough. Yet his feet moved. He laid the hammer carefully on the post, his movements deliberate, unhurried. He walked not toward them, but on a parallel line, closing the distance slowly, as if tracking a deer he had no intention of spooking. The woman did not see him until he was 100 yards away. When she did, her body went rigid. She pulled the child behind her, a single, fierce motion of protection that spoke of a life lived in constant defense. Her hand went to the boy's head, holding him close. She did not call out. She simply waited, her dark eyes fixed on him, a well of caution so deep it seemed bottomless. Silas stopped. He did not raise a hand in greeting. He just stood there, a tall, quiet man in a dusty coat, his presence another feature of the harsh land. He could see her more clearly now. Her face was thin, her cheekbones sharp beneath skin the color of rich earth. Her hair, long and black, was whipped across her face by the wind. She was Apache, that much was clear, but there was a fragility in her frame that warred with the unyielding strength in her gaze. He saw the cracked leather of her shoes, the threadbare weave of her blanket roll. He saw the boy peeking out from behind her legs, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Finally, the wind died for a moment, and in the sudden, ringing silence, her voice came, thin but clear, carried on the air like a dry leaf. "We mean no trouble." It was not a plea. It was a statement, a boundary drawn in the dust. Silas gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He had no words for this. The part of him that made small talk had died on a winter night with a fever and a final, rattling breath. All he had left were actions. He turned and walked back toward his cabin, his long strides eating up the ground. He did not look back to see if she was following. He knew she was watching, her mind racing with suspicion and desperate calculation. Inside the small, dim barn, the smell of hay and old leather hung in the air. He untied his horse, a sturdy sorrel mare, and led her out into the unforgiving sunlight. He did not saddle her. He simply led the horse back to where the woman and child stood, a silent, unmoving tableau of defiance and despair. He stopped a few feet away and held out the reins. The woman stared at the worn leather strap as if it were a snake. Her eyes flickered from the horse to his face and back again. There was no kindness in his expression, no pity. There was only a quiet resolve, a stark and simple offer. "Why?" she whispered, the word nearly stolen by the wind. Silas did not answer. He just held the reins steady. He was not a man of charity. He was a man of ghosts, and for a reason he could not name. The sight of the small boy, no older than his own had been, had stirred something in the settled dust of his heart. It was an impulse, sharp and unwelcome, a memory of a duty he thought he had long since buried. The boy, Cale, looked at the horse with a child's unfiltered awe. He took a small step forward, his fear momentarily forgotten. Alara's hand tightened on his shoulder, pulling him back. She looked at Silas again, her gaze searching his for the trap, the hidden price she knew always came with such gestures. She found nothing. His eyes were gray, the color of a winter sky before a storm, and they held a deep, unshakable sorrow. They were the eyes of a man who had already lost everything that mattered. That she understood. Slowly, she reached out and took the reins. Her fingers brushed his, and the brief contact was like a spark in the cold air. She said nothing more. With a quiet grace, she lifted her son onto the horse's broad back, then pulled herself up behind him, settling into the space with the ease of someone born to the saddle. Silas turned and began to walk toward the distant shape of his cabin. The horse followed, its hooves making a soft, rhythmic thud on the hard-packed earth. He did not offer her a destination. He did not ask her name. He had simply seen a need and acted. A flicker of change in a life that had been static for years. A quiet journey had begun. The cabin was not a home. It was a shelter. A single room built of rough-hewn logs, with a stone fireplace at one end and a small, curtained-off alcove for a bed at the other. It was clean but sparse, stripped of anything that might suggest comfort or joy. A table with 2 chairs, a dry sink, a few pots hanging from hooks near the hearth. Everything had its place. Everything was functional. There were no photographs, no trinkets, no signs of a life lived, only of a life endured. Alara slid from the horse's back, helping Cale down. She stood in the doorway, her hand resting on her son's shoulder, taking in the profound emptiness of the place. It felt like the inside of the man who stood beside her, scoured clean by some past grief, leaving only the bare essentials for survival. Silas gestured toward the barn. "You can stay there. There's fresh hay." He went inside his cabin without another word, leaving her on the threshold. She watched him go, her caution warring with a desperate, bone-deep exhaustion. The barn was better than the open plains. A roof was better than the endless sky. For her son, she would accept. For Cale, she would swallow her pride and her fear. She led the boy to the barn. It was large and well-kept, the air cool and smelling of sweet hay and earth. A ladder led to a loft, and she saw a pile of clean, thick blankets folded neatly in one corner. The man was prepared for something, though she could not guess what. She spread one of the blankets over a thick bed of hay, creating a small nest for them. Cale, his small body finally giving in to his fatigue, curled up almost immediately and fell into a deep sleep. Alara did not rest. She sat by the large barn doors, slightly ajar, and watched the cabin. She was a survivor, and survivors learned to observe. They learned the rhythms of a place, the habits of the people in it. They learned to anticipate danger before it arrived. She watched as Silas moved about his cabin, his shadow passing before the single window. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, no wasted motion. He built up the fire, his silhouette briefly framed by the orange glow. He prepared a meal, the simple sounds of a pot and spoon carrying across the quiet yard. A short while later, the cabin door opened. He walked toward the barn, carrying a wooden plate and a tin cup. He did not approach her directly. He set the plate and cup on the ground a dozen feet from the barn door, then turned and walked back to his cabin without looking at her. On the plate was a piece of cornbread and a thick slice of salted pork. The cup was filled with fresh, cool water from the well. Her stomach clenched with a hunger so sharp it was painful. She had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. She waited until the cabin door was firmly shut before she moved. She crept out, retrieved the food, and retreated back into the shadows of the barn. She woke Cale gently and split the meal with him, giving him the larger share. They ate in silence, the simple sustenance of profound comfort. And so the routine began. Each morning, Silas would rise before the sun. He would tend to his horse, milk his single cow, and then set about the endless work of his homestead. He never spoke to her. Each morning and each evening, he would leave a plate of food and a cup of water or milk near the barn door. He never acknowledged her presence, yet he provided for it. Alara, in turn, established her own rhythm. She did not take his charity for granted. While he worked the fields, she would take a bucket to the well and draw water, leaving it on his porch. She found a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin and began to meticulously weed it, her long fingers coaxing life back into the parched soil. She found his mending basket, the contents stiff with disuse, and began to repair his torn shirts and worn trousers, her stitches small and neat. She would leave the mended clothes, folded, on the same porch railing where she left the water. It was a silent conversation, an exchange of labor for sanctuary, a careful, delicate balance built on unspoken rules. Trust did not come. It was a luxury she could not afford, and one he seemed to have no interest in offering. He remained a mystery, a man encased in a shell of grief so thick she could not see a way inside. She saw the way he would sometimes stop his work and stare at the small, crude wooden cross on the hill overlooking the cabin. He would stand there for long moments, his shoulders rigid, a statue of loss. She knew then that his silence was not born of cruelty, but of a pain that had stolen his words. Cale was the bridge, the only thing that crossed the silent divide between them. He was a child, and a child's world is not governed by the cautious rules of wounded adults. He would sometimes sit on the barn steps and watch Silas chop wood, his small face a study in concentration. One afternoon, while Alara was washing their few clothes in the creek, Cale found a piece of charcoal from an old fire pit. He sat on the ground and began to draw on a flat, pale stone he had found. He drew a tall, stick figure with a wide-brimmed hat. He drew a smaller figure beside it. Then he drew a horse. When Silas returned from the fence line, he found the stone sitting on the porch steps. He stopped and looked down at the child's simple drawing. He stared at it for a long time, his expression unreadable. He did not pick it up. He simply stepped over it and went inside. But the next morning, when Alara came to leave the water bucket, the stone was gone. She looked around, a flicker of unease in her chest. She found it later, tucked carefully on the windowsill inside the barn, safe from the wind and rain. A small, secret acknowledgement. An action that spoke louder than any word he could have offered. The quiet pact held for weeks. The days grew shorter, the nights colder. The wind began to carry the first sharp bite of autumn. The change in seasons brought a new urgency to the work. Silas spent his days reinforcing the cabin against the coming winter, chinking the logs with fresh mud and straw. He split and stacked firewood until a small mountain of it stood against the side of the cabin, a bulwark against the cold. He worked from sunup to sundown, his movements fueled by a relentless, quiet energy. He seemed to be preparing not just for a change in weather, but for a long siege. Alara watched him and she understood. Winter in these parts was not just a season. It was a predator. Could isolate you, starve you, and freeze the hope right out of your heart. She worked just as hard, her tasks shifting with the needs of the season. She gathered late-season berries from the thickets down by the creek, her fingers stained purple. She dried herbs she found growing wild, hanging them in fragrant bunches from the rafters in the barn. She helped harvest the meager offerings of the vegetable garden, a handful of tough-skin squash, a basket of potatoes. She was storing up life, just as he was. They continued their silent ballet of exchange. She would leave small bundles of dried herbs on his porch. He would leave an extra blanket on the hay in the barn. She would patch a tear in his heavy coat. He would leave a small whittled toy, a bird with delicate wings, where Cale could find it. These were not gifts. They were provisions, acknowledgments of their shared, unspoken goal, to survive the coming dark. One afternoon, Alara noticed the wind whistling through a gap in the barn wall, near where she and Cale slept. It was a small crack, but she knew that in the depths of winter, a small crack could be a deadly thing. She tried to stuff it with spare bits of cloth and hay, but the wind was persistent, prying her efforts away. She knew she could not ask him for help. To ask would be to admit a weakness, to upset the delicate balance they had established. It would turn his provision into a debt, and she had carried enough debts in her life. So she did her best and tried to ignore the cold finger of air that touched her face as she slept. The next day, Silas told her he was riding to the far pasture to check on a section of fence that had been damaged by a rockslide. He would be gone the entire day. She nodded, watching him saddle the sorrel and ride out, his figure shrinking against the horizon. As soon as he was gone, she set about her own work. But when she returned to the barn in the late afternoon, leading Cale by the hand, she stopped short. The crack in the wall was gone. In its place was a new, neatly fitted piece of wood, the edges smoothed and sealed tight against the wind. The fresh sawdust on the ground was the only sign of the work. He had seen. He had known her need without her speaking it, and he had waited until she was away to fix it, sparing her the humility of watching him do for her what she could not do for herself. A strange warmth bloomed in her chest, a feeling so unfamiliar it almost frightened her. It was not gratitude, not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper. It was the feeling of being seen. That evening, as the sun bled across the western sky in hues of orange and violet, she saw him sitting on his porch, holding something in his hands. It was a small wooden rocking chair, one of its rockers split clean in two. He was running his hand over the splintered wood, his touch gentle, almost reverent. She had seen the chair before, tucked away in a dusty corner of the barn, covered with a canvas sheet. It was a woman's chair, small and delicate. She did not need to ask whose it had been. The sorrow that settled over him as he touched it was answer enough. He began to work on it, his knife moving with a surgeon's precision, carving a new piece of wood to match the old one. He worked until the light failed, his shoulders hunched over the task. The air grew heavy, the sky turning a bruised, ominous gray. The wind, which had been a constant companion, fell utterly silent. An unnatural stillness settled over the homestead, the kind that comes before a storm. The clouds gathered on the horizon, thick and dark, piling on top of one another like mountains of slate. A storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the quiet spaces between the two lonely souls living side by side in a vast and unforgiving wilderness. It was the kind of storm that would break things open, forcing what was hidden into the light. The storm did not arrive with a roar, but with a whisper. A few fat, cold drops of rain at first, splattering in the dust like dark coins. Then a steady, percussive drumming on the roof of the cabin and the barn. A sound that grew in intensity until it was a relentless roar, drowning out all other noise. The temperature plummeted. The rain turned to sleet, then to a thick, wet snow that clung to everything it touched. A blizzard, sudden and ferocious, had descended upon them, locking the homestead in a world of swirling white. Inside the barn, Alara huddled with Cale under every blanket they possessed. The new patch on the wall held firm, but the cold was a physical presence, a creeping thing that seeped through the walls and floorboards. It stole the warmth from their bodies, leaving them shivering in the damp, frigid air. Cale, who had been coughing for a day or two, began to shiver violently. His breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Alara pressed her hand to his forehead. It was burning hot. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her exhaustion. A fever, here, in the middle of a blizzard with no medicine and no help. It was a death sentence. She wrapped him tighter, trying to force her own body heat into his small, trembling frame. She murmured soothing words in her own language, prayers to spirits she wasn't sure still listened. His shivering worsened. His eyes, when they fluttered open, were glassy and unfocused. She knew, with a certainty that hollowed her out, that he would not survive the night in the freezing barn. The cold would feed the fever, and the fever would consume him. She had to do something. She had to break the unspoken rules. She lifted Cale, his small body a dead weight in her arms, wrapped him in the thickest blanket, and stumbled out of the barn into the maelstrom. The wind tore at her, blinding her with a curtain of snow. She could barely see the cabin, a faint yellow light from its single window, a ghostly beacon in the chaos. She fought her way across the yard, the snow piling up around her ankles, her own breath freezing in her lungs. She reached the cabin door and pounded on it with her free hand, her blows muffled by the storm's fury. "Please!" she cried out, her voice a raw, desperate thing. "Please, my son." The door swung open. Silas stood there, his face grim, the firelight behind him casting his tall frame in shadow. He did not need an explanation. He saw the child in her arms, the panicked terror in her eyes. He stepped back without a word, holding the door wide. She stumbled inside, collapsing onto the floor by the hearth, clutching her son to her chest. The sudden warmth was a shock to her system. Silas shut the door, the roar of the storm instantly muted to a low howl. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hand gently touching Cale's forehead. His face tightened. He rose and went to the dry sink, soaking a rag in the water bucket. He returned and began to gently wipe Cale's face and neck, his movements surprisingly tender. "Put him on the bed," he said, his voice rough but steady. It was the first direct command he had ever given her. She hesitated for only a second, looking toward the curtained alcove. It was his space, his private world. But the desperation for her son's life overrode everything else. She carried Cale to the narrow rope bed and laid him down gently. Silas pulled a heavy quilt over him, then returned to the fire, adding more logs until it blazed, filling the small cabin with a fierce, protective heat. The night became a long, shared vigil. Alara sat on a small stool by the bed, never taking her eyes off her son. Silas sat in his chair by the fire, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the flames. They did not speak. There was no need. They were united in a single, silent purpose: to fight the encroaching darkness. He would get up periodically to tend the fire or to bring her a fresh, cool rag for Cale's head. Once, he pressed a tin cup of hot, weak tea into her hands. She took it, her fingers trembling, and drank. The warmth spread through her, a small anchor in a sea of fear. Hours crawled by. The storm raged outside, a wild beast trying to claw its way in. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, and the child's labored breathing. Alara felt her own strength failing, her hope fraying with every rasping breath her son took. She must have dozed off, her head slumping forward, because she was startled awake by a hand on her shoulder. It was Silas. He was holding out a bowl of thin broth. "Eat," he said. It was not a suggestion. She took the bowl and ate, the salty liquid reviving her. When she looked up, he had taken her place on the stool by the bed, the damp cloth in his hand, his gaze fixed on the boy. She watched him, this silent, grieving man, as he tended to her child with a solemn, practiced care. She saw then that this was a familiar ritual for him. He had done this before. He had sat through a long, dark night, fighting a fever, and he had lost. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. His grief was no longer an abstract thing. It had a shape, a sound, a temperature. It was the shape of a small body in a bed, the sound of a desperate fight for breath, the temperature of a fevered brow. She had not been brought into his home. She had been brought into his memory. Sometime before dawn, the rhythm of Cale's breathing began to change. It deepened, steadied. The violent shivering subsided into a faint tremor. Alara rushed to his side, her hand flying to his forehead. The fire was still there, but it was banking. The terrible, searing heat had begun to recede. She looked at Silas, her eyes wide. He met her gaze and gave a single, slow nod. The fever was breaking. Alara sank to her knees, relief so overwhelming it felt like a physical collapse. Tears she had refused to shed for months streamed down her face, silent and hot. She did not weep for herself, but for her son's life, a fragile flame that had almost been extinguished. Silas stood up and walked to the window, pushing aside the rough cloth that covered it. The wind had died down. The snow had stopped, A pale, gray light was beginning to filter into the world. The storm had passed. He stayed at the window, his back to her, granting her the privacy of her tears. In the quiet of the cabin, with the fire crackling softly and the world outside blanketed in a pure, unbroken white, something had shifted. The walls between them, built of silence and suspicion, had been breached. She had let him in. The world outside the cabin was transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine snow. The sun, when it finally rose, cast long blue shadows and made the landscape glitter as if it were strewn with diamonds. It was a world made clean, scrubbed of its dust and imperfections. Inside the cabin, a similar quiet cleansing had occurred. The crisis had passed, leaving behind a fragile, altered stillness. Cale slept soundly, his breathing deep and even, a flush of healthy color returning to his cheeks. Alara sat by the fire, mending one of Cale's small shirts, her hands moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. The simple, domestic act was an anchor, a return to normalcy after the terror of the night. Silas was at the table, carefully cleaning his rifle, the metallic click and slide of the mechanism the only sound in the room. The air between them was no longer heavy with unspoken questions, but settled, imbued with a shared experience. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and he had not turned away. She had seen the ghost of his past, and she had understood. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft in the quiet room. He had a wife, it was not a question. It was a statement of fact, offered gently. Silas's hands stilled. He did not look at her. He stared down at the polished wood and blued steel in his hands. Her name was Sarah, he said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse. And a son. Thomas, he said the names as if they were fragile objects he had not touched in a very long time. He set the rifle piece down carefully on the table. He looked over at the small, unmarked grave on the hill, visible through the cabin window. Same fever. 5 years ago this winter. The snow came early that year, too. Trapped us. By the time it cleared, it was too late. The story was spare, delivered in short, clipped sentences. Yet it filled the cabin with a sorrow so profound Alara felt the weight of it in her own bones. All his solitude, his rigid routines, his impenetrable silence. It all made sense now. He was not just living alone. He was serving a penance. She finished her stitch and knotted the thread. She looked down at her own hands, at the calluses and scars that told their own story. My husband was named Taza, she said, her voice equally quiet. He was a good man. Strong. He worked for a man with a lot of land, Mr. Croft. He promised us a small piece of our own if Taza worked for him for 5 years. She paused, the memory a bitter taste in her mouth. There was an accident with a horse. Crushed him. Croft said the debt was not paid. He said I still belonged to him. That my work belonged to him. The shame and anger from that time rose in her, but she pushed it down. She had learned long ago that such emotions were a fire that only burned the one who held them. I took my son and I ran in the night. We have been running ever fleeing for months. She did not speak of the hunger, the fear, the men who had looked at her with greed in their eyes. She did not have to. He would understand. He was a man who understood the shape of loss. Silas finally looked at her, his gray eyes meeting hers across the room. The emptiness in them was still there, but it was different now. It was a shared emptiness, a known landscape. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an acknowledgement of her pain, a recognition of their common story. They were both survivors of a world that took without asking. He picked up the rifle again, his movements once more precise and focused. But the silence that fell between them now was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had looked into the abyss and seen their own reflection in the other's eyes. They had spoken their dead's names aloud, and in doing so had made a space for the living. Later that day, Cale woke up. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. The first thing he saw was Silas, sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of wood. The boy smiled, a small, sleepy curve of his lips. Silas stopped his work. He looked at the boy, and for the first time since she had met him, Alara saw the faintest softening around his eyes, a flicker of warmth in the winter gray. The foundations of their quiet arrangement had been irrevocably altered. They were no longer just a man and the refugees he had sheltered in his barn. They were three people in a room, bound together by the memory of a storm. The homestead remained snowbound for nearly a week. The world was a white, silent prison, but inside the cabin, a new rhythm took hold. It was no longer his space and their temporary shelter. It became a shared territory. Alara cooked their meals at the hearth. The simple act of stirring a pot of stew filling the room with a sense of domesticity it had not known in years. Silas repaired the broken rocker, his hands gentle and sure, the scrape of his tools a soothing, industrious sound. Cale, recovering his strength, would sit on a blanket by the fire, drawing on a piece of smoothed bark with a bit of charcoal. His childish creations a testament to the life returning to their small world. When the snow finally melted enough to make the road passable, the reality of their situation returned. Their supplies were low. The salt pork was gone, the flour sack nearly empty. A trip to the town of Redemption was unavoidable. A knot of apprehension tightened in Alara's stomach. The town was a place of staring eyes and sharp whispers. For a woman like her, an Apache woman alone with her son, it was a place of danger. Silas seemed to sense her unease. "I will go," he said one morning, pulling on his heavy coat. But Cale had other ideas. He had been cooped up for too long. "I want to go," he said, his voice clear and insistent. He looked from his mother to Silas, his dark eyes pleading. Alara hesitated. To take him was a risk, but to leave him behind after his illness felt cruel. Silas looked at the boy, then at her. "We will all go," he said. It was a decision, not a suggestion. "It is better if we are seen together," she understood his meaning. A lone woman was a target. A woman with a man, even a silent, grim-faced man like Silas, was a different matter. It offered a thin shield of protection. They rode together, Silas on his sorrel mare, with Cale sitting proudly in front of him, his small hands clutching the saddle horn. Alara rode the gentle pack mule, a blanket roll tied behind her. The town of Redemption was little more than a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a church whose steeple seemed to lean with weariness. As they rode in, heads turned. Windows parted. The usual low hum of the town fell quiet, replaced by a current of murmurs and stares. Alara kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her back rigid. She felt the weight of their judgment, the familiar sting of being an outsider. Silas seemed oblivious, his gaze sweeping over the town with a cool indifference. They dismounted in front of the general store. "Wait here," Silas said, his voice low. He went inside, leaving her and Cale standing by the horses. It was then that she saw him, Mr. Croft. He was stepping out of the saloon, a big man with a florid face and a cruel twist to his mouth. He was flanked by two other men, rough-looking ranch hands who smirked at his side. Croft's eyes landed on her, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He sauntered toward them, his boots kicking up dust. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Look what the wind blew in. I thought I told you to stay put." Girl, Alara's blood ran cold. She instinctively pulled Cale behind her, shielding him with her body. "We are not your property," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. Croft laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Aren't you? Your husband died in my debt. That makes you my debt. That's the law of this land." He took a step closer, his eyes lingering on her with a possessive leer. Several men had drifted out of the saloon and the store, forming a small, silent audience. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity and cruel amusement. None of them moved to help. They were the warriors of the town, men who fought only for their own gain and entertainment. "I'm taking you back," Croft said, reaching for her arm. "You and the boy. You'll work off what's owed." At that moment, the door to the general store opened. Silas stepped out, a sack of flour over one shoulder. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. Croft's hand reaching for Alara, the fear in her eyes, the smirking crowd. He set the flour sack down gently on the porch. He did not draw the Colt that rested low on his hip. His reputation as a man who could use it was enough of a threat. He simply walked down the steps and placed himself between Croft and Alara. He was taller than Croft, leaner, but there was a coiled stillness in him that made the bigger man pause. "There's a misunderstanding here," Silas said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. Croft bristled, his face turning a shade darker. "This is none of your business, Drifter. This is between me and my property." Silas's gaze did not waver. He looked past Croft at the watching town, at the silent, judging faces. Then he looked at Alara, who stood behind him, her hand gripping Cale's shoulder so tightly her knuckles were white. He made his choice. He reached back, his hand settling firmly on her shoulder, in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. It was a public declaration, an act that would change everything. "She is with me," Silas stated, his voice ringing with quiet authority in the sudden silence of the street. He held Croft's gaze. "She has chosen." The words hung in the air. She has chosen. It was not a claim of ownership, but an affirmation of her will. He was not saying he owned her. He was saying she had picked her own path, and it was with him. Croft stared, his mouth working silently. He looked at Silas's hand on his gun, at the unyielding coldness in his eyes. He looked at the faces of the townsmen, who were no longer smirking. They knew Silas's story, the story of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to fear. Croft was a bully, not a fool. He knew a fight he could not win. With a final, venomous glare, he spat in the dust. "She ain't worth dying for," he snarled, and turned on his heel, stalking back into the saloon with his men trailing behind him like curs. The crowd dispersed, melting back into the storefronts, their moment of entertainment over. Silas's hand remained on Alara's shoulder for a moment longer. Then he dropped it, picked up the sack of flour, and loaded it onto the mule. The ride back to the homestead was silent, but the silence was different. It was not empty. It was filled with the weight of the words spoken, the line drawn in the dust of redemption. He had not fought for her with his gun. He had fought for her with a choice, and in front of everyone he had made her his. The journey home was marked by a profound and peaceful quiet. The harsh winds of the plains seemed to have gentled, and the sun warmed their backs. The tension that had been a constant companion in Alara's shoulders for months had finally begun to ease. The declaration in town had not been a boast or a threat. It had been a statement of fact, a foundation laid bare for all to see. It changed the very ground beneath their feet. When they arrived back at the cabin, the place looked different. It was no longer just a shelter or a refuge. It was a destination. It was home. The routine they fell back into was familiar, but its meaning had shifted. It was no longer an exchange of services for safety, but the shared work of building a life. They moved her and Cale's few belongings from the barn into the cabin. Silas cleared a space for their bedrolls near the hearth, the warmest part of the room. He did it without ceremony, a simple, practical act that spoke volumes. The first evening, after a simple meal of stew and fresh bread, Silas brought the finished rocking chair and placed it by the fire. The new rocker was seamless, the wood sanded smooth and oiled to a soft sheen. It was a beautiful piece of work, a resurrected thing. He did not say who it was for. He simply put it there and returned to his own seat. Later, as Cale grew sleepy, Alara picked him up and, without hesitation, sat in the rocker. She settled Cale in her lap and began to rock, a slow, gentle, rhythmic motion. The chair creaked softly, a sound that was instantly comforting, a sound of peace and permanence. Silas watched them from his chair, his hands idle in his lap. He watched the firelight play over their faces, the soft curve of Alara's cheek, the peaceful expression on Cale's sleeping face. A log shifted in the fire, sending up a shower of sparks. The cabin was warm and safe, a small bastion against the vast, dark wilderness outside. Cale, lulled by the motion and the warmth, began to hum a soft, tuneless song, the sound a gentle murmur in the quiet room. The sound of a child, happy and safe, filled the space that had for so long been occupied only by silence and ghosts. That night, after Alara had put Cale to bed, she found Silas on the porch, staring up at the star-dusted sky. She came and stood beside him, wrapping a thin shawl around her shoulders against the night's chill. For a long time they just stood there, breathing in the cold, clean air. "Thank you," she said softly, not looking at him, "for what you did." In town, he continued to look at the stars. "Croft is a man who respects only strength," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He had to be shown he had no claim. It was more than that," she insisted gently. "You gave me a choice." He finally turned his head to look at her, his profile sharp in the moonlight. "A man doesn't own a person," he said, the words coming out as if they were a creed he had long held. "He can only offer a place to stand. The standing is up to them." In his simple, plain-spoken way, he had given her the one thing she had not had in a very long time, dignity. He had not rescued a damsel. He had stood beside a survivor and affirmed her strength. That was a gift far greater than shelter or food. Cale's laughter became a more frequent sound around the homestead. He followed Silas around like a shadow, helping with chores, asking endless questions that Silas would answer with surprising patience. One afternoon, Cale presented Silas with a new drawing, this one on a precious piece of brown wrapping paper from the general store. It showed 3 figures, one tall, one medium, one small, standing in front of a square house with a crooked chimney puffing out smoke. Over their heads, he had drawn a huge, smiling yellow sun. Silas took the drawing and looked at it for a long moment. He didn't smile, but the lines around his mouth softened. He walked into the cabin and tacked the drawing to the wall next to the fireplace, right in the center of the main wall. It was the first and only decoration in the entire cabin. A child's drawing of a family. A home was being built, not just with logs and mud, but with small gestures of acceptance and the sound of a child's laughter. The seasons turned. The harsh white of winter gave way to the soft greens of spring. The earth thawed, and with it, the frozen ground of Silas's heart seemed to yield. The silence in the cabin was no longer a heavy, sorrowful thing, but a comfortable quiet, the easy silence of people who understand one another without the need for constant words. From silence came warmth. It grew slowly, like a spring shoot pushing its way through hard-packed soil. It was in the way Silas would leave a wildflower he'd picked on the table for her in the morning. It was in the way she would save him the best piece of meat from the stew, placing it on his plate without comment. It was in the way Cale would run to meet him at the end of the day, his small hand fitting perfectly into Silas's large one. One evening, as a cool spring rain pattered on the roof, Alara was rocking Cale by the fire. The boy was already asleep, his head nestled in the crook of her arm. She was humming the same soft, tuneless song she always did, the gentle sound weaving itself into the crackle of the flames and the drumming of the rain. She was weary from a long day of planting the garden, her muscles aching with the good, honest fatigue of productive work. Silas had been sitting at the table, mending a piece of harness leather, but his hands had stilled. He was watching her. She felt his gaze not as an intrusion, but as a gentle weight, a quiet presence. He rose from his chair, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked over to the hook by the door where his heavy, sheepskin-lined coat hung. It was the coat he had worn for years, the one that had protected him through countless winters. It was a part of him, a symbol of his solitude and self-reliance. He took the coat from the hook. He walked over to the rocking chair and, without a word, he draped it carefully over her shoulders. The coat was heavy, imbued with the faint sense of wood smoke, leather, and the cold outdoors. It was imbued with him. The sudden weight and warmth were startling, but she did not flinch. She did not pull away. The gesture was so unexpected, so deeply tender, it stole the breath from her lungs. She leaned her head back slightly, resting it against the thick, soft collar. It was an acceptance, a surrender not of her will, but of her defenses. She was letting his protection surround her, accepting his care as something freely given, not as a payment for a debt. He stood behind her chair for a long moment, his hand resting lightly on the back of it. He could feel the gentle, rhythmic motion of her rocking through the wood. In that simple, silent act, a promise was made. He was offering her not just his coat, but his warmth, his strength, the shelter of his name and his home. She was accepting it not as a refugee seeking sanctuary, but as a woman choosing her place, her partner. The creak of the rocker was the only sound in the room, a steady, peaceful heartbeat. The ghosts of Sarah and Thomas of Taza were not gone. They were simply quiet now, their sorrowful whispers replaced by the living warmth of the three people by the fire. The past had been honored, and the future was being allowed, finally, to begin. He had wrapped her in his past, and in doing so had offered her a future. She closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the coat like a gentle embrace, and continued to rock her sleeping child. Home. This was home. Summer arrived, painting the plains in a coat of sun-bleached gold and green. The garden Alara had so carefully tended flourished under the long, warm days. The corn grew tall, and the squash vines snaked their way across the rich earth, their broad leaves offering shade to the ripening fruit below. Life on the homestead settled into a new, enduring rhythm, one of shared purpose and quiet affection. The three of them moved as a unit, their individual lives braided together into something new and strong. In the mornings, Silas and Alara would work together in the garden, their hands moving in concert as they pulled weeds or watered the thirsty plants. Kale would play nearby, chasing grasshoppers or making small forts out of twigs and stones. There was an ease between them now, a comfortable companionship that had been forged in the crucible of hardship and cemented by a public stand. They still spoke little, but their communication was seamless. A shared glance across the field was enough to signal it was time for water. A simple touch on the arm was enough to offer comfort after a long day's work. One hot afternoon, they were kneeling side by side, harvesting the first of the season's potatoes. Alara's hands moved deftly through the soil, unearthing the small, pale tubers. Silas worked beside her, his larger hands just as gentle, brushing the dirt from each potato before placing it in the basket between them. The sun beat down on their backs, and the air was thick with the smell of warm earth and growing things. A hawk circled high overhead, its lonely cry the only sound in the vast, quiet landscape. As Alara reached for another potato, her hand brushed against his. He did not pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over and let his fingers close gently around hers. His palm was rough and calloused from years of hard labor, but his touch was soft. It was not a gesture of passion, but of quiet, profound connection. A simple acknowledgement of all they had become to one another. She looked up at him. His gray eyes, which had once seemed so full of winter storms, now held the calm, clear light of a summer sky. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was the first time she had ever seen him truly smile, and it transformed his face, easing the hard lines of grief and solitude that had been etched there for so long. She smiled back, a genuine, radiant smile that lit up her own face. In that moment, surrounded by the bounty of the earth they had tended together, they were no longer two separate, wounded souls. They were a family, rooted in the soil of a place that had become their own. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it, and they returned to their work, the shared basket between them filling with the fruits of their labor. The coat, his old, heavy coat, still hung on its hook inside the cabin door, a permanent fixture now, a silent testament to the promise made on a cold spring night. It was no longer just his. It was theirs, a symbol of the warmth and shelter they had found in each other. She had not just stayed for a night or a season. She stayed.